Beneath the polished floors of a Manhattan brownstone and the steamy breath of 100 orchids, something poisonous was blooming, quietly, deliberately, and far too late. A brilliant mind was found lifeless beside a flower too rare to be innocent, and a lie rooted in science began to unravel. In this case, intellect becomes a double-edged blade, and even beauty can't mask betrayal. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was a Wednesday morning in March, which meant the orchids were due for their weekly mollycoddling, and I had drawn the short straw. Or maybe it wasn't a straw so much as a familiar stretch of bad luck. Working for Nero Wolfe, you learn quickly that optional and orchid don't belong in the same sentence. I was in the plant rooms, sweating in a climate that made Panama look underheated, and noting temperatures for rows B through F like a good little sergeant. Wolfe's voice had echoed in my memory from earlier that morning. 10 degrees variance is homicide, Mr. Goodwin, not horticulture, which might have meant something profound, but to me it just meant, don't screw up. Meanwhile, down in the kitchen, Fritz was busy boiling something that could have passed for pond runoff. I could smell it from the greenhouse vents. He'd called it a nettles and leek restorative, which translated to Archie eats out tonight. By the time I'd finished the third column on Wolfe's impossibly precise log sheet, I was seriously considering an act of sabotage involving a garden hose and one of his prize cattleyas. That's when the front door buzzer went off. I didn't know yet that it would bring a woman with a face like a scandal and an orchid like a loaded gun, but I'd soon find out. I made it to the front door in 7 steps flat and opened it to a woman who could have made the statue in Wolfe's front hall blush. She wore a storm coat the colour of dry moss and carried a flat wooden box under one arm, just about the size you'd bury a cat in. Her hair was damp and unruly in a way that looked more expensive than accidental, and her eyes were the kind you don't meet unless you're being measured for something. "Is this the residence of Mr. Nero Wolfe?" she asked. "It's either that," I said, "or a very well-staffed greenhouse with a cranky librarian in charge." She didn't smile. Instead, she handed me a card. Dr. Leona Vale, Department of Botanical Sciences, Columbia University. "I need a consultation," she said, "and possibly a post-mortem, preferably before lunch." That got my attention. So did the box. It was unlabeled, but damp on one corner, and something about it made my instincts twitch like a cat on a radiator. I stepped aside. "If it's murder you're bringing in that thing, Doc, he'll say no. If it's orchids, he'll say maybe. If it's both, well, you're in for a real show." We made it to the office without Wolfe calling out, which meant I was either lucky or about to be yelled at. Wolfe was in his chair, of course he was, and had just placed his morning beer beside a copy of the Journal of Tropical Pathology. His eyes rose half an inch above the rim of his glasses. That was all. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "what is that box, and why is it damp?" "This is Dr. Leona Vale," I said. "She has a question about a plant, and possibly a corpse." "I see," Wolfe said, which meant he didn't. "Sit, Doctor, but do not place that object on my desk." Leona Vale took the red chair without hesitation and set the box on her lap. She flipped the lid. Inside was a single orchid stem, half wilted, mottled with faint red speckles. The colour wasn't natural, not even close. "This," she said, "is Bulbophyllum milburniae, a hybrid. My mentor, Professor Edgar Milburn, created it. Last week he died in his greenhouse. The police say it was an accident. He inhaled toxic spores from a nepenthes vine." "Then he was careless," Wolfe replied. "Botany is often a suicidal profession." Leona didn't blink. He was careful, obsessively. And that flower bloomed after his death, when it shouldn't have bloomed at all. Wolfe looked at her for a full 10 seconds. Then he looked at the plant again. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "get me a beer. I may need a buffer." Wolfe sniffed once, at the orchid, not the woman, and leaned back in his chair like a man avoiding an unpleasant odour. "Doctor," he said, "I am not a forensic horticulturist, nor am I inclined to entertain conjectures dressed in Latin and watered with grief." Leona's jaw tightened. "I didn't come for sentiment. I came because someone used a greenhouse like a weapon, and nobody seems to care." That earned her a raise of his left eyebrow. Not both, just the left, which was as much of a concession as Wolfe handed out before lunch. "Plants do not murder," he declared. "They defend, yes. They poison, certainly. But they do not premeditate." I cleared my throat. "If it helps, she's not asking you to arrest a ficus, just to take a look at the circumstances." Wolfe looked at me with the expression of a man asked to share a bath. "Mr. Goodwin, I trust your judgment in jazz and sandwiches, not botany. We are done here." Leona didn't protest. She simply reached back into the box and produced a photograph, placing it on the edge of the desk like a card in a game she hadn't finished playing. "This orchid bloomed 2 weeks too early," she said softly. "You tell me what that means." Wolfe didn't reach for the photo, but he did peer at it with the exact expression he uses when Fritz tries to sneak garlic into a béarnaise. It showed a close-up of the same orchid, Bulbophyllum milburni, if that was its real name, fully open, its petals curled back like a thing mid-scream. The timestamp in the corner read March 3rd. According to Leona, Milburn had died on the 4th. "That's impossible," she said. "It shouldn't have bloomed for another month. We bred it to respond only to specific light and heat levels. Milburn was monitoring the conditions down to the decimal. There's no way this could have happened naturally." Wolfe finally reached out, pinched the photo between 2 fingers like it might be contagious, and studied it with grim concentration. "And yet it did," he murmured. Archie Goodwin, professional interrupter, stepped in. Unless, of course, someone adjusted those decimal points after the professor checked out. Leona nodded. "Exactly. Someone wanted the bloom to happen prematurely, to confuse the timeline." Wolfe dropped the photo back on the desk and exhaled like a man forced to consider the moral capacity of petunias. "If you're suggesting that someone used temperature controls and plant biology to simulate an accidental death," he said, "then I find that implausible. Also, intriguing." That eyebrow went up again, this time the right one. A rare event. I almost applauded. Leona stood, slowly, and returned the wilted orchid to its box. Wolfe didn't protest, which meant something. "I understand," she said. "You don't believe me." "I believe," Wolfe replied, "that many things bloom without warning. Delusion among them." She gave him a tight smile. "Professor Milburn wasn't just a mentor. He was my collaborator. We shared everything, research, patents, recognition, and for the last 3 months he was paranoid. He told me someone was watching him in the greenhouse at night." "Then he was unwell," Wolfe said. "He called me the night before he died, crying." That landed like a thunderclap. Even Wolfe blinked. "He said he'd made a mistake," she continued, voice steady now. "He begged me to come in the morning, said he'd explain everything. I never got the chance." She picked up her coat and moved toward the door. "Keep the photo," she said, "and the orchid. It doesn't matter if you take the case. It'll still bloom again, just like it did for him." And with that, she was gone. The box left behind on Wolfe's desk like a calling card from a ghost. I waited a beat, then said, "Well?" Wolfe reached for his beer. I abhor manipulation, he said, especially from women bearing flowers. But he didn't throw the orchid away, which, coming from Wolfe, was practically an invitation to murder. The box with the orchid was still sitting on Wolfe's desk when I returned from seeing Leona out. I lingered at the threshold just long enough for Wolfe to notice me. Not so long that he'd think I wanted to talk. He did anyway. "That," he announced, pointing at the orchid as if it had insulted his ancestry, "is a grotesque." "I thought you liked orchids," I said, strolling. "I like orchids that do not serve as props in melodramas involving sobbing scientists and improbable hybrids." He picked up the photo Leona had left and studied it again, holding it between two fingers like it might leave sap. "Mr. Goodwin, I have tolerated many idiocies under the banner of cases, romantic delusions, financial hallucinations, murder by umbrella. But this plant tale, dressed in myth and menstruum, is beneath our dignity." "Is it the plant that bothers you?" I asked, "or the fact that she might be right?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Leaves do not wield intent. Orchids, for all their elegance, do not kill. They are incapable of conspiracy." "That one bloomed after the professor died," I said. "It bloomed early," Wolfe snapped. "Early blooming is not evidence of murder. It is evidence of manipulated horticulture and overwrought imagination." He waved a hand. "This is not a murder. It is a plant, and I will not be made to dance by a bulbophyllum." Which, coming from him, was pretty much a line in the sand. But I'd seen lines like that blur before, usually around beer number 3. "Leona Vale," I said as I took my seat, "has published 6 peer-reviewed papers, 2 on genetic propagation, 1 on thermal response triggers in crossbred species, and 1 that made the New York Times science section." Wolfe harumphed. "She also helped co-develop a temperature-reactive strain of Venus flytrap that made an entomologist faint." "Then she is dangerous," Wolfe said. I shrugged. "Maybe, but I'd rather have her on this side of the microscope." He didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the orchid like it had personally wronged him. "It's not just the flower," I continued. "It's the setup. A paranoid professor, a lab assistant who's probably hiding something, a university board that wants it all wrapped with a bow." Wolfe sipped his beer. "Mr. Goodwin, you are romanticizing a coincidence." "Maybe. But even you admitted the bloom was premature." "That is not the same as evidence." "No," I agreed. "But it's the kind of thing that makes me want to dig. And don't tell me you're not curious. You just used the word grotesque. That's practically passion." That earned me a glower, but behind it I could see it, just a glint, the glimmer of irritation giving way to reluctant intrigue, which, in Wolfe speak, meant we were halfway there. Dinner that evening was served with what Fritz called wild nettle persuasion. It came in the form of a sautéed green heap that steamed like a compost pile and smelled worse. I took one bite and reached for my water. Wolfe took none at all. "Fritz," he said, setting his fork down like it had betrayed him, "you have been seduced by fashion." Fritz looked wounded. "It is restorative, high in calcium and magnesium." "It tastes," Wolfe said, "like penal servitude." I tried to help. "Tastes like someone cooked a raincoat." Fritz retreated, grumbling in Austrian. As he disappeared into the kitchen, Wolfe pushed his plate away and leaned back. "I abhor violence," he muttered, "but culinary assault may test me." I saw my chance. "You know what's worse than nettles? Getting strangled by a temperature gauge." He closed his eyes. "Spare me." But he didn't get up and leave, and he didn't change the subject, which meant the nettles had done their part. The next morning, I brought in the mail with a flourish, an old habit Wolfe loathes, and placed it in a neat stack beside his coffee. On top, a letter with a Columbia University watermark. "Dr. Vale must have pulled strings fast," I said. "That, or they want you to disappear into a fern somewhere." He sighed. "Open it." I did. Inside was a typed note from the university board offering Wolfe a $10,000 fee to evaluate the possibility of foul play in Professor Milburn's death and provide a written conclusion. Wolfe's eyes skimmed it. He didn't reach for the check, yet. But I saw the flinch behind the frown. "It's a bribe," he said flatly. "It's a consultation fee," I countered, "also known as money, the stuff that buys steak. They expect me to produce a theory built on foliage and female nerves. They expect you to be smart and rich. You're already one." He gave me a long look, then tapped a finger once on the armrest. "That orchid," he said, "will have to be repotted," which meant we were 95% there. With Wolfe, that's practically a commitment. That evening, after dinner had mercifully returned to a nettle-free format, I found Wolfe in the plant room. The glow lamps cast long shadows over rows of green, and the smell of humid soil hung in the air like a stubborn argument. He stood near the south bench, inspecting a Miltonia hybrid with the solemnity of a judge. He didn't turn when I entered. "You are fond of her," he said. It was not a question. "I'm fond of mysteries," I said, "especially the kind with thermostats and crying botanists." He clipped a dead leaf and let it fall. "She is passionate, dangerous, the kind of woman who wraps emotion in intellect and calls it evidence. She's also probably telling the truth. That," he said, "is immaterial. What matters is whether the truth is useful." I folded my arms. "Then why are we out here talking to orchids instead of reading the sports section?" He turned slowly and regarded me with that infuriating calm. "Mr. Goodwin, do you know what infuriates me? Other than nettles, wasted minds, fraud disguised as science, and the persistent notion that truth is relative. Sounds like you just accepted the case." He exhaled through his nose. "I abhor being manipulated, but I abhor stupidity more. If someone has dressed murder in petals and called it natural, then it is not merely an insult to Milburn, it is an affront to civilization." I grinned. "So you're in?" He nodded once, reluctantly, but civilizingly. And just like that, the hunt was on. The orchid, for now, stayed in the corner, but I could have sworn it was smirking. The Milburn estate was about 90 minutes north of Manhattan, which gave me just enough time to lose feeling in my left leg, finish a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, and call Saul Panzer twice for unrelated reasons. The place itself sat at the end of a gravel drive so long it could have used rest stops. The main house was early-century stonework, grey, square, and grim, and the greenhouse to the west looked like someone had welded a glass ship to its flank. Security was no joke. There was a steel gate with a keypad, a camera above it blinking red like a nervous tick, and 2 motion sensors posted by the greenhouse's back entrance. Either Milburn didn't trust burglars, or he didn't trust his colleagues. Given the world of academia, I placed my bet on the latter. I was met by a man with an iPad and a bad attitude who scanned my credentials, grunted at my face, and pointed toward the greenhouse like it might bite. Inside, the air hit me like soup, warm, sticky, and perfumed with something bitterly floral. The plants were housed in spotless rows, labeled in Latin, and positioned under a complicated grid of lighting and humidity nozzles. It was cleaner than Wolfe's kitchen and twice as tense. And standing near the center, blinking rapidly as if trying not to cry, was a woman in a white lab coat with streaks of orchid soil on the cuffs. Margot Leland. We were off to a beautifully awkward start. Margot Leland looked up as I approached and swiped at her eyes, though the tears had already done their job. She was young, 20s maybe, and wore the kind of exhausted expression that said she'd memorized every inch of the greenhouse and still hadn't figured out what went wrong. "You're here from the insurance company?" she asked, voice tight. "Not unless they've started sending charming detectives instead of actuaries," I replied. "Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe." She blinked again. "He sent you?" "He sends no one lightly, or happily. Consider it a compliment." She didn't smile. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured toward the central grow bed. "That's where we found him, lying next to the Nepenthes chamber. He was still clutching his clipboard." "Romantic," I muttered. She ignored it. "The official report said he inhaled a toxic burst when the vines self-triggered, but the controls were manual. He knew that." "Any chance he flipped the switch himself?" Her face darkened. "No. He was meticulous, almost paranoid. He kept double locks on the environmental settings. Someone tampered with it." I took a slow glance around. "Any enemies?" Margot hesitated. "He didn't get along with Knox." "Knox?" "Harlan Knox. Another botanist. Used to work with Milburn. They had a falling out." "And?" Her fingers twitched near a pot of ferns. "And Knox was here the day before Milburn died. They argued, loudly." "Nice timing." She looked away. "He said Milburn was clinging to ideas that should be buried with the compost." I pulled out my notebook. Nothing like professional jealousy with a body on the floor. I didn't have to go looking for Harlan Knox. He found me. He came striding into the greenhouse like he'd been invited to narrate a documentary, tall, sandy-haired, and dressed in a tweed blazer that screamed, "I publish frequently." The smile he wore had too many teeth and none of them friendly. "Well, well," he said, offering a hand I didn't take. "You must be Nero Wolfe's monkey." "Call me a monkey again," I said, "and you'll find out how hard I throw bananas." He chuckled. "Touchy. I like that. I suppose you're sniffing around for scandal?" "Nope. Just facts." "Well, here's one for free." He glanced toward the bed where Milburn had expired. "Edgar was brilliant, but he got sloppy, obsessed. He was working on a compound that mimicked natural plant toxins. Dangerous stuff. And he didn't believe in safety protocols." "Are you saying he killed himself by mistake?" Knox gave a shrug too casual by half. "Call it Darwin. He poked too hard at the wrong vine and got what was coming." I watched his eyes. They didn't waver. "You and Milburn weren't exactly on hugging terms." He smiled again. "We disagreed. I thought he was wasting his legacy on theories. He thought I was commercializing the future." "And were you?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Somewhere in the humid buzz of the greenhouse, a leaf fluttered under the weight of too much silence. Of course, it was just my luck that the moment Knox strolled off, trailing smugness like aftershave, Inspector Kramer came stomping in. I could smell the cigar 2 seconds before he appeared under the greenhouse arch, chewing it like it owed him rent. "Goodwin," he growled. "Tell me Wolfe's not actually interested in this potting soil fairy tale." "Depends on how you define interested," I said. He did raise both eyebrows. That's usually serious. Kramer snorted. "That lunatic Milburn cooked his own goose, or orchid, or whatever the hell it was. Case is closed." I glanced at the grow bed. Funny. Most closed cases don't include tropical vines that only bloom if the temperature's right. He narrowed his eyes. "What's Wolfe feeding you now? Photosynthesis and paranoia?" "Maybe. but someone jiggered with the environmental controls. The timing's tight. Or maybe, he said, the old man leaned in too close and got a mouthful of whatever venom those Nepenthes bastards spit. It's not rocket science. No, I agreed. It's botany. Just deadlier. He pointed at the carnivorous plant with his cigar. That, right there's your killer. Took one breath too many, and down he went. The end. I didn't say anything, because right then I noticed a smear of something pale green along the control panel, wiped, but not clean. And that didn't feel like the end to me. Kramer had just finished explaining how death by carnivorous flora was an open and shut case when a new player slid into the greenhouse like a man who didn't sweat, literally or metaphorically. Dean Whitmore wore his suit like a press release, trim, tidy and crafted to look calm while he buried bodies. His hair was combed with laboratory precision, and his handshake was soft enough to make a taxidermist uneasy. "Mr. Goodwin, is it? From Mr. Wolfe's office." His voice had the same polished, harmless lilt as a sedative. "That's me," I said. "And you're—" "Dean Whitmore. I oversee academic administration for the Biological Sciences Division. Professor Milburn was a valued member of our institution." "Was?" "Yes, of course. Tragic, what happened. A terrible accident." "Fast diagnosis." He gave a practiced frown. "Naturally, we've all been quite shaken. However, it's essential that we manage the messaging. You understand?" I understood all right. What he meant was, let's keep the university name out of the papers and maybe you'll get a fruit basket. He gestured around the greenhouse with mild disapproval. "It's regrettable that the incident occurred here, in such a visible facility." "You mean in public?" He smiled. "In funded space." I glanced at Kramer, who looked ready to chew his cigar sideways, then back at Whitmore, who was already turning away, murmuring something about liability exposure. I'd met a lot of people who didn't care how someone died, as long as it wasn't on their lawn. Whitmore was just the first to wear cufflinks while saying it. After Whitmore vanished in a cloud of vague reassurances and over-polished vowels, I figured I'd earned a little quiet snooping. The greenhouse wasn't just Milburn's workplace. It was his fortress. The benches were neatly arranged, the humidifiers regulated to decimal points, and the LED grow lights glowed with an artificial serenity that made you feel like a bug under a magnifying glass. But even the most obsessive minds leave fingerprints. Or at least, mistakes. It was near the northeast quadrant, where the experimental orchids were shelved in sealed humidity domes, that I noticed something off. One of the heating valves, metal, rusted at the joint, was smeared with something greyish. Grease, maybe, or residue from a glove. It had been twisted too hard and not recently. I crouched and leaned in. The label read, "Temp Circuit D, Bloom Accelerant Line." Now, I don't have Wolfe's brain, but I can read labels. Someone had overridden the temperature regulator, likely to force a premature bloom. I reached beneath the shelf and felt something wedged in the crevice behind the water tubing. It was brittle, burnt. I pulled it free carefully, half a page, charred at the edges, still smelling faintly of chemicals and ash. Written in ink, barely legible. "Reduces spore release latency. Synthetic mimic replicates Nepenthes toxin. Lethal in." That was all I got. The rest crumbled. It wasn't just sabotage. It was a blueprint for it. And Milburn had either written it or died because of it. By the time the sun had begun dripping gold over the treetops, I found Harlan Knox in the greenhouse annex, leaning against a cluttered workbench and nursing something smoky in a square glass. He looked like a man rehearsing for a eulogy he didn't want to give. "Back again?" he asked, sipping. "Did the orchids tattle?" "Not yet," I said. "But they're definitely side-eyeing you." He chuckled. "You're good. I'll give you that." I held up the charred scrap I'd bagged. "Recognize this?" He squinted. "Milburn's handwriting. I'd bet on it." So, what was he playing with? Synthetic toxins? Orchid-borne delivery systems? Something fancy enough to get him killed? Knox exhaled slowly. He was chasing brilliance. Wanted to outdo nature. Thought he could engineer a compound that would revolutionize crop protection and maybe drop a few jaws at the next conference. Sounds risky. He knew it. That's why he kept it quiet. But not quiet enough. Knox didn't answer. He just stared into his glass. Then he said, "Genius always thinks it's safe, right up until it isn't." I left him there, marinating in regret or gin, hard to tell which. But his timing still stank like fertilizer left in the sun. Just before I packed it in for the day, I made one last circuit of the greenhouse. Something about Margot's story still itched at me, like a tag left in your collar. Near the back wall, behind a storage cabinet, was a cooling drawer labeled "Refrigerated Hybrids, Do Not Disturb." Naturally, I disturbed. Inside, nestled in a sealed plexi tray, was an orchid stem. Not just any stem. It was Bulbophyllum milburni, identical to the one Leona had brought to the brownstone, except this one looked pristine, perfectly preserved, no signs of wilting or stress. And, here's the kicker, the label had a date stamp, March 6th, 2 days after Milburn's death. So either Milburn had ghost-bred a new specimen from beyond the grave, or someone had been cultivating lies alongside the orchids. I snapped a photo and closed the drawer gently. 2 orchids, 1 murder, and someone was very carefully curating both. The junior greenhouse technician was the kind of guy who wore goggles on his head even when he wasn't using them. His name was Brad, no last name offered, and he spoke like someone afraid his boss was hiding in the begonias. I caught him rearranging sample trays in the cold chamber and introduced myself with my usual charm. "Don't worry," I said. "I'm not here to shut you down or steal your research. I'm just asking questions on behalf of a man who hates orchids but loves puzzles." Brad blinked. "You mean Mr. Wolfe?" "Bingo." He hesitated, glanced over his shoulder, then leaned in a little. "You saw the milburni, right? The orchid?" "Can't unsee it." Brad's voice dropped. "That strain, it was brand new, not even documented yet. Milburn was still testing viability. He called it a controlled anomaly, said if it survived cold climate stress, it'd be a breakthrough." "So why was it blooming in the tropical chamber?" "It shouldn't have been," Brad whispered. "That's the thing. It couldn't handle the warmth yet, not without strict conditions. Light timing, mist intervals, nitrogen balance. All that had to be perfect." "And was it?" He shook his head. "It was tampered with. I noticed it the morning after, March 5th. Someone had overridden the settings on Chamber B. The system showed normal, but I swear the temperature had been climbing all night." "Anyone else have access?" He hesitated. "Only Dr. Leland and Dean Whitmore. Technically." "Technically," I said, "is my favorite kind of access." Brad gave me a wide-eyed look. "Who would mess with the orchid just to make it bloom early?" I gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Brad," I said, "when you figure that out, call me. And keep the goggles on. I've got a feeling this place bites." The control room for the greenhouse looked like the cockpit of a spaceship designed by gardeners with engineering degrees. Dials, sliders, digital timers, and a touchscreen interface that displayed everything from mist frequency to UV bulb pulse rates. I had Brad with me to do the translation, since my foreign language credits in college didn't include orchid climate code. We pulled up the log from the night of Milburn's death. "See here," Brad pointed. "This is where the chamber B thermostat was supposedly locked at 21.5 Celsius. That's baseline for passive orchid dormancy." Supposedly. He tapped the touchpad and brought up the raw sensor data. "Here's the thermal spike, from 21.5 to 27.3 over 6 hours. Not enough to fry an egg," I said, "but just enough to make a tropical flower throw a party." "Exactly," Brad said. "But the control panel doesn't show the change unless you cross-check with the sensor log. Someone manually overrode the thermostat and then wiped the main record." "Sounds like someone wanted the orchid to do something it wasn't ready for." Brad nodded. "Can you tell who logged in?" "No. Whoever did it bypassed the main authentication. You'd need admin access." "Whitmore." He didn't answer, which told me enough. I gave the panel a slow nod. "So someone faked a plant's behavior by turning up the heat." Brad looked nervous. I looked curious. And somewhere in the back of my mind, Wolfe was already asking for tea and gloating in Latin. Naturally, being me, I couldn't leave well enough alone. Brad had gone off to file something, or more likely, hide. And I decided to check the fumigation chamber one more time. It was tucked behind the east end of the greenhouse, down a corridor marked "Authorized Personnel Only," which I took as a warm invitation. The chamber itself was a rectangular steel and glass coffin designed to sterilize infected plants with a cocktail of warm air and approved toxins. Wolfe would have called it a chamber of vulgar efficiency. I just called it suspicious. Milburn had been found near it. Not inside it, but close enough. I stepped in. The door stayed propped open with a foot wedge. The control panel hummed softly. A faint chemical scent lingered in the vents. Nothing active, just the ghost of something sharp. I leaned down to inspect the floor drain, just a glance, and the door slammed shut behind me. Instantly, the panel beeped. Lights turned amber. The overhead hissed, and a slow spray began to drift from the ceiling like fog in a horror movie. I hit the door. Nothing. I hit the emergency release. Dead. The mist thickened. I muttered something that would have made Wolfe faint. The chamber was sealed, and someone had turned it on. I dropped low to the ground, used my jacket sleeve as a filter, and crawled toward the back ventilation shaft. The bolts were loose. Someone had tampered with the panel cover. A minute later, I forced it open and rolled out into the corridor, coughing like a cat with a furball problem. This wasn't just a warning. It was a test run, and I'd just been the guinea pig. By the time I stumbled out of the chamber, the mist had thickened into a breathable offense. I collapsed onto the tile, coughing hard enough to rattle my fillings, and dragged in air like a drowning man kissing dry land. Brad showed up 2 minutes later, eyes wide. "Holy! What happened?" "Door locked," I croaked. "System activated. Somebody wanted me sterilized from the inside out." He looked horrified. "That shouldn't even be possible without a supervisor override. Tell that to my lungs." He helped me to my feet and guided me back through the corridor. I was still wheezing when we reached the admin wing, just in time for Kramer to saunter in mid-lecture to a junior officer about something involving parking cones. He stopped when he saw me. "You look like you've been slow roasted." "Close," I rasped. "I got locked inside the fumigation chamber." Kramer snorted. "Probably leaned on the wrong button. Those panels are touchy." "That wasn't clumsy, Kramer. It was sabotage." "You sure it wasn't you playing Sherlock where you didn't belong?" I glared. "Pretty sure murder isn't a fire drill." Kramer jammed the cigar back between his teeth. "Goodwin," he said, "if every jammed valve and misfired sensor was a case, we'd have to arrest half the gardeners in the Bronx." And with that, he walked off. leaving me choking, and not just on the fumes. Later that evening, with my lungs mostly back in service, I placed a call to the brownstone. Wolfe picked up himself, which meant Fritz was busy or the world was ending. "You sound hoarse," Wolfe said. "Attempted gassing'll do that to a man." There was a long pause. "Explain." I did. From the heating override to the charred note, and finally to the fun little field trip inside the sterilization chamber. When I got to Kramer's reaction, Wolfe made a sound that might have been mistaken for a sigh, if he were capable of such vulgarities. "Inspector Kramer," he said, "possesses the logic of a turnip and the imagination of a plough. He thinks Milburn got clumsy with the machinery. Nonsense. He thinks I got clumsy with it. Unforgivable nonsense." I leaned back. "So, what now?" "Now," Wolfe said, "we allow the fools to shout while we listen to the orchids." Poetic. Practical. He hung up. I stared at the receiver for a second. Kramer was digging in the wrong dirt, but Wolfe was already trimming the roots of something that smelled more like conspiracy than compost. When I got back to the brownstone the next morning, Fritz met me at the door with a steaming cup of coffee and a worried look that could have soured cream. "You look pale," he said. "I look alive," I countered. "We're calling that a win." Inside, Wolfe was in the plant room, surrounded by botanical journals, chromolithographs, and something that looked suspiciously like a formula sheet. He didn't look up. "The orchid, Milburni. Have you determined how it was manipulated?" "Working on it," I said. "But someone wanted it to bloom on cue, and early." "Unnatural," Wolfe muttered. I didn't answer. He wasn't really talking to me. He was talking to the page. "Fritz!" Wolfe bellowed. Fritz appeared instantly, napkin still in hand. "Remove all chlorophyll-bearing vegetables from the kitchen, immediately." Fritz blinked. "All, sir?" "Yes. Spinach, kale, chard, parsley, anything with a green pigment." "But what will we eat?" "Meat, bread, civilization." Fritz retreated, mumbling something about barbarism. I leaned against the wall. "What's with the vegetable vendetta?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "If murder is being framed with petals, Mr. Goodwin, I prefer not to be complicit, even on a plate." Just as Wolfe was preparing to launch into an epilogue on botanical ethics, the front bell rang. It was Saul Panzer, which, in our line of work, is the equivalent of a priest walking into a poker game. You stop bluffing and start listening. He stepped inside, brushed off his coat, and handed me a sealed envelope. "Surveillance log," he said. "Milburn Estate, night shift." I opened it. Timestamps. Still shots. And one image that made my eyebrows do a solo. "Tell me about this one," I said. Saul pointed to the timestamp. March 5th, 11:43 p.m., the night after Milburn's death. Security cam on the north end caught someone entering through the greenhouse annex. The figure was grainy but clear enough. Medium build, gloved hands, hooded coat, face obscured. No ID tag, no key swipe. Whoever it was knew the blind spot and used a manual latch. Inside long. 26 minutes. Left with something under the coat. Flat, like a tray or file case. Wolfe, who had drifted over with surprising stealth, spoke from behind me. "Leona Vale." "Could be," I said. "Or Whitmore, or someone else playing dress-up." Wolfe folded his arms. "Mr. Goodwin, it appears someone returned to remove what Milburn left behind." I nodded. "Yeah, and I'm guessing it wasn't his lunch." Leona Vale called me just after breakfast. I was at the brownstone sipping coffee and watching Wolfe glare at a crate of bruised tomatoes Fritz had mistakenly ordered when the phone rang. Her voice came through sharp and low, like a violin string pulled tight. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "do you have 5 minutes? For you, I'll even put my shoes on." We met at a little cafe near Columbia. She was already seated when I arrived, her coat draped across the back of the chair, eyes hidden behind dark lenses that made her look more like a diplomat than a scientist. "I lied," she said, without preamble. "About what?" She pulled a folded paper from her coat. A photocopy, an abstract from a research grant. Milburn and I were working on something big, a temperature-sensitive orchid strain with military and agricultural applications, but before he died, he told the board he was cutting me out of the publication. Why? He said I'd compromised the integrity of the trial, which was ridiculous. I did all the field data. I tracked the first blooms. So you argued. Furiously. 2 days before his death. I told him he had no right to erase me from our work. He said I didn't understand what was at stake. And what was? I don't know, she said quietly. But whatever it was, it scared him. She looked up, eyes meeting mine now. You think I had a motive? Lady, I said. Everyone does. But some motives don't kill. She folded the paper again. Tell that to the orchid. It bloomed anyway. I didn't have an answer to that, but I made a mental note to check who else had a copy of that grant. Sometimes betrayal doesn't grow in the open. It grows under glass. By late afternoon, I was back at the Milburn estate, flashing the same visitor badge I'd used all week and getting fewer smiles each time. The place had taken on a funereal quiet. Too quiet, even for a research greenhouse with more sensors than conversation. I headed for Margot Leland's quarters, a small converted office at the back of the admin wing, tucked beside a forgotten break room and a cabinet of expired microscope slides. The door was ajar. I pushed it gently and stepped in. The air was wrong, too cold, and tinged with something floral and acidic, like perfume and fertilizer had thrown hands. The room had been turned over, not ransacked but swept, deliberately. Papers were scattered across the desk and floor, most of them printouts of lab readings, climate logs and temperature curves. A few were torn along the edges, like someone had ripped pages from a binder in a hurry. On the carpet near the trash bin was a broken glass vial. The scent of orchid oil still lingered, sharp and cloying, and the closet door stood wide open, with nothing inside but a hanger askew. No suitcase, no coat, no shoes. Margot Leland was gone. I found a notebook on the bed, half filled with scribbles and field notes. The last page was ripped clean out. I checked the window. Still locked. The emergency exit at the end of the hall? Unlatched. Recently. Someone had left in a hurry, or been helped to disappear. I picked up the broken vial, sealed it in a plastic slip, and made a call to Wolfe. "She's missing," I said. He responded with one word. "Expected." Kramer showed up 20 minutes later, grim-faced and ready for action, or at least performance. He let the local officers clear the room, then stood by the broken vial like it told him bedtime stories. "She ran," I said. "Or she was taken." He grunted. "She offed herself." "Oh, come on." Vial of extract, handwritten notes shredded, climate data strewn everywhere. Classic guilt pattern. She cracked. Couldn't live with what happened to Milburn. "She cracked a window," I said, then locked it from the inside. "She left through the emergency exit. That's what they're for. But she's not a suspect, and there's no suicide note." "She had motive," he said. "You just told me she was afraid. Guilty people usually are. Or framed people." Kramer chewed his cigar without lighting it. "You'd see a conspiracy in a grocery list. Only if the groceries include nerve toxin and rare orchids." He grunted again. "We'll issue a missing persons alert, but I'm putting it down as voluntary disappearance. Suicide pending confirmation. You'd close a case with no body. If it makes sense. And if it doesn't?" He shrugged. "Then Wolfe gets to feel smug when I'm wrong." Which will be, "Not today, Goodwin." He stomped out, trailing cynicism and stale tobacco. I knelt down beside the torn notebook. Not today, maybe. But we were getting close, and whoever wanted the truth buried had just pulled out a fresh spade. I returned to the brownstone to find Wolfe in the plant room, buried in a stack of notes that looked like they'd been clipped from 4 different botanical centuries. He was snipping dead leaf tips from a Miltonia orchid with the kind of disdain most men reserve for tax codes. "She's missing," I told him. "Margot. Room cleaned, vial broken, exit unlatched. Kramer's calling it suicide." He didn't look up. "Far," he said. "Margot Leland is no more suicidal than you are celibate." "Thanks for the vote of confidence." He reached for a magnifying lens. "Describe the note." There wasn't one. Just a torn page missing from her notebook and a half-empty bottle of orchid oil. He finally looked up. "What kind?" "Cymbidium blend. Strong stuff. Lingering." "Too convenient," he said. "Tell me about the field notes." They were real. Temperature curves, humidity logs, all shredded except for what I grabbed, but the last page was yanked. "You think it was planted?" He sniffed. "Planted or pruned. Either way, someone was tending the scene." I dropped the vial on his desk in a plastic slip. He didn't touch it. "Mr. Goodwin, emotion is no evidence. Guilt may produce grief, but so may fear. She knew something. And now, she either ran from it or was silenced by it." I gave a low whistle. "You think she's dead?" He leaned back. "I think someone is pruning witnesses like overgrown ivy. And if we're not careful, they'll trim the investigation next." The next morning, I drove back to the estate and cornered Harlan Knox in the greenhouse's annex, where he was busy dictating notes into a recorder and pretending not to smirk when he saw me. He offered me a seat I didn't take and poured himself something herbal that I wouldn't have touched with gloves. "More questions, Goodwin?" he asked. "Or are you just enjoying the flora?" "Tell me about the research," I said. "The one Milburn was protecting like the Holy Grail." Knox's smile faded an inch. "It wasn't the research. It was the result." "Go on." He leaned back. Milburn had developed a compound, a biological mimic that could replace synthetic pesticides. It worked by targeting insects using a bio-coded release trigger, but he also believed the compound could be weaponized. That's what made him paranoid. So paranoid he cut out his co-author. "Fail?" Knox scoffed. "She's brilliant, but reckless. She'd have sold the formula to a cosmetics firm or a biotech investor. Milburn wanted to publish in a peer journal. He didn't want to commercialize it." "And Whitmore?" Knox's lips thinned. "He wanted it buried." "Why?" "Because if it got out that Columbia had developed a compound with dual-use potential, meaning agricultural and biochemical applications, the university would be buried under 100 federal investigations." He set down his glass. "You want to find the killer. Ask who had the most to lose if Milburn talked." "Okay," I said. "Then why are you still nervous?" He didn't answer, but his fingers tightened around the edge of the table like he was holding back a tremor. The university boardroom was one of those minimalist affairs that felt more like a wellness spa than a place where careers got disemboweled. I sat in the corner during a catered luncheon Wolfe had no interest in attending, citing the social friction of academia as incompatible with digestion. My job was to observe, not stir. Whitmore sat 2 seats from the dean, sipping green tea and nodding at all the right intervals. A man smooth enough to iron himself, until someone mentioned greenhouse protocols. A junior administrator brought up a request to audit environmental access logs. Suddenly, Whitmore's calm cracked. He adjusted his tie. Twice. "That's unnecessary," he said. The logs were cleared with campus security. The board should focus on faculty safety going forward. Wouldn't that include knowing who accessed the building? I asked from my chair. Heads turned. Whitmore looked at me like I'd just crawled out of the HVAC system. Mr. Goodwin, you're a guest. I'm a licensed investigator, I said, and you're dodging harder than a politician near a budget cut. A faint ripple of unease passed around the table. Whitmore smiled, brittle. We're here to mourn a colleague, not chase ghosts. I didn't reply. I just made a note. People don't flinch when you ask about flowers. They flinch when you ask who watered them. Saul Panther, who could find a tax return buried in a swamp, met me that evening at the brownstone with a file thick enough to kill a spider. Knox's academic fraud case, he said, setting it down. The one Kramer keeps referencing. And? Clean, Saul said. He didn't fudge data. He exposed someone else who did. Hero, not villain? Pretty much. His department head tried to bury the story. Knox went to the press, lost his tenure track, but won a quiet settlement and a minor cult following. Which means? Means the story was spun, likely by the same circles that didn't want Milburn's new findings public. Motives multiply, I muttered. Saul shrugged. Whitmore had reason to discredit Knox. So did Leona. So did Milburn, if he thought Knox would leak the formula. Everyone's got a shovel, I said. Just depends whose dirt they're standing in. Saul tipped his hat and left. I watched the file sit like a paperweight on the truth. Knox was no fraud, but someone had buried his name anyway, and now Milburn was buried too. Fred Durkin and I met at the greenhouse just before closing. The guards had been shuffled, less budget, more PR, and the place smelled like someone had tried to sanitize guilt with eucalyptus oil. Fred, wearing his usual trench coat and his don't ask just point expression, led me to the rear wall of Chamber B. This is the vent access, he said. Top-mounted humidity regulators feed from here. But look at this. He unscrewed the top grate and pointed to a narrow PVC bypass that had been spliced into the original ductwork, crudely but cleverly. Added vent line, he said, timed to override the internal misting system. I crouched to look closer. The joint had been sealed with silicone, still soft. New, I said. 2-3 weeks max. Could have altered humidity, chemical dispersion, even temperature if they used a feed heater. He handed me a sample swab from the inside lining. It glistened faintly green. Test that, he said. It's not standard mist. What does this mean? Fred shrugged. Means someone rewired the weather, and not for the plants. I stood. Milburn hadn't died in a greenhouse. He'd died inside a machine someone had turned into a murder weapon. Wolfe would want every measurement, every trace, and I had a feeling we were just starting to see how deep the roots went. Delivering Nero Wolfe's summons is a bit like serving subpoenas from Olympus. No one wants it, and no one refuses it. I started with Leona Vale, who was pruning a thistle with the kind of vengeance usually reserved for enemies. She looked at Wolfe's note like it might bite her. He wants all of us, she said, eyes narrowing. He insists, I replied. And trust me, when Wolfe insists, it's not a request, it's gravity. Next was Harlan Knox, whom I caught grading lab reports with a red pen so aggressive I feared for the paper. He took one look at the envelope and didn't blink. Finally, he said, like he'd been waiting for a chess match to resume. Whitmore was harder. I found him pacing in a glass corridor of the university's botany wing, trying to look busy while avoiding actual people. When I handed him the summons, he exhaled like he'd just lost the fight he'd been pretending not to be in. Why now? Because the weather's right, I said. And maybe the truth is in bloom. And then came Margot. She opened her motel room door in Newark with eyes like broken porcelain, pale, tight, unslept. Saul Panther stood behind her, arms crossed. "You've got to be kidding," I said. She wasn't. She followed me down the hall, silent as regret. Wolfe's office was not built for drama. It was built for orchids and opinions, and both were fully stocked. The winter-blooming specimen sat dead center on his desk, vivid and smug. A crossbreed with petals like bruised ivory and veins that looked suspiciously like fingerprints. Wolfe sat behind it like Jupiter behind a thundercloud. Margot occupied the red chair. Her sudden reappearance had stolen all the early dialogue. Kramer, seated stiffly near the globe, kept one hand on his hat like he was thinking about throwing it. "I should arrest her," he growled. "You should wait," Wolfe said. "The law does not prosper by impatience." Leona sat with crossed legs and a smile too sharp. Knox fiddled with a button on his cuff. Whitmore stared at the orchid like it was a ticking bomb. I stood. Wolfe folded his hands. "Thank you for coming. This orchid," he gestured, "is not only rare, it is impossible. It should not bloom in winter." No one moved. "Yet it has," he paused, "because someone rewrote its environment." I watched Whitmore's eye twitch. Wolfe continued, "The same someone who believed the greenhouse could be a laboratory and a trap, a place of life and of precise death." Knox scoffed. "That's a poetic flourish." "No," Wolfe said coolly. "It is murder with an alibi in chlorophyll." Wolfe began with what he always does. Facts. Not feelings, not theories. Data. And in this case, climate. He tapped the stack of greenhouse logs I'd ferried back from the estate like they were chapters from a confession. The humidity variance on the night Milburn died was recorded at 11%. The auto-regulator should never exceed 3% without manual override. He paused, looked at Margot. "You logged out at 6:30 p.m. You claimed nothing unusual." "I didn't notice," she muttered. "I was distracted." "Understandable," he said. "You were fleeing from murder or toward it. That remains to be seen." Kramer grunted. Wolfe turned to Leona. "You claimed you saw Milburn last at dinner, yet his meal tray was untouched. The kitchen logs show no late orders, so he skipped dinner. So what? So why was the thermostat in Chamber B manually reset at 9:12 p.m.? She didn't answer. Wolfe looked at Knox. "You admitted to reviewing Milburn's compound, and yet your own records show you accessed Chamber B's maintenance terminal at 9:15. Which proves nothing. On the contrary, it proves opportunity and lack of originality." Finally, Wolfe's gaze shifted to Whitmore. "You approved the grant money, the greenhouse design, and every override installed in that system." Whitmore licked his lips. "The records don't show me there." "Correct," Wolfe said, "because your key card was used at the library, but the library camera shows you arriving after the greenhouse logs your credentials." "That's impossible!" "It would be," Wolfe said softly, "unless you gave someone your access, or paid them to use it." And just like that, the room chilled. Wolfe swiveled slightly, which in his world is the equivalent of a cartwheel. "Miss Leland," he said, "it is time to explain." Margot looked down at her hands, then up. Her voice was small but clear. "I was paid to disappear." "By whom?" Kramer barked. She hesitated. "An envelope. In my mailbox. No name. $2,000. Cash. A note that said, 'Disappear for 7 days, or be the next orchid to wilt.'" That got their attention. Wolfe interlaced his fingers. She took it seriously. he said, which means she knew the threat was credible. Kramer scowled. Where'd you find her? Saul Panzer did, I said. A motel in Newark, room service and zero contact. She didn't even turn on the TV. Leona shifted uncomfortably. Knox stared at the floor. Whitmore clenched the arms of his chair like they owed him money. Wolfe continued. The motive was simple. Remove the most inconvenient witness without a murder. Miss Leland saw something, heard something, that tied the greenhouse sabotage to the victim's death. For that, she had to vanish. But I didn't tell anyone, Margot cried. No, Wolfe said. But you panicked, and someone saw that. He pointed at the orchid. This was engineered. Not only the plant, but the room, the air, the timing. His eyes swept the room. And one of you built that design to kill. Wolfe turned to the orchid like it had just confessed under oath. This hybrid, he said, is not merely decorative. It is instructive. Knox shifted in his chair. It's just a plant. No, sir, Wolfe countered. It is an alibi in bloom. He gestured to the petals, waxy and flushed with deep violet streaks. This species, he said, requires a minimum of 80 degrees Fahrenheit for 48 uninterrupted hours to reach this stage of flowering. Kramer frowned. So someone turned up the heat? Precisely, Wolfe said. The greenhouse venting system was manually overridden at 7:41 p.m. the night of Milburn's death, not before. That's hours after he died, I said. Indeed. Wolfe's gaze didn't move from the flower. The killer needed the orchid to bloom as misdirection, proof, supposedly, that Milburn was meddling with the system in a reckless experiment. Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. His expression was that of a man watching his best bluff get called with a royal flush. Margot whispered, I noticed the heat, but I thought it was just malfunctioning. Wolfe arched a brow. How convenient. For everyone but the deceased. There was silence. Then he added, when a flower blooms in defiance of nature, one must ask who made it lie. And just like that, the orchid was Exhibit A. In a murder. Wolfe tapped the slender report folder I'd handed him an hour before, like it was the final act of a symphony he had long known the tune of. Dr. Milburn did not die from spores, he announced. Leona looked up. Knox leaned forward. Whitmore froze. Wolfe opened the folder with the grace of a man peeling an orange. This is the toxicology report, commissioned privately to avoid institutional interference. The compound found in Milburn's bloodstream mimics the properties of a rare fungal alkaloid, one known to occur in the roots of a South American ghost orchid. Knox blinked. But those aren't in the greenhouse. No, Wolfe said. And that is the point. He tapped the page. This version was synthesized. No organic markers, no plant DNA, just lab-born chemistry with the elegance of murder. Kramer scratched his chin. How'd it get in him? Delivered via a mist diffuser in Chamber B, Wolfe said. Fitted into the base of the humidifier, activated by the override. Margot looked sick. Leona swore softly. That's brilliant, Wolfe said. Yes, as well as monstrous. He folded his hands. To create this compound would require precise chemical knowledge, access to the university's restricted stock, and familiarity with Milburn's routines. He let the implications hang like fog. Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. Again. Kramer crossed his arms. And who fits all those qualifications? Wolfe didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, the orchid between him and the rest of the room. The plant didn't kill Milburn, he said, but it gave someone the perfect excuse to hide the real poison. And suddenly, the lies weren't just blooming. They were blooming on command. It was finally time to watch the man sweat. Wolfe turned his attention fully to Professor Whitmore, who was suddenly paler than the orchid's stem. "The grant for greenhouse renovations," Wolfe began, "was approved under the condition that funds be used solely for climate control research." Whitmore swallowed. "Yet invoices show significant purchases from offshore horticultural brokers," Wolfe continued. "And your signature appears on authorization forms for species not legally approved for hybrid experimentation." "Those purchases were supervised by Milburn." "Incorrect," Wolfe said. "Milburn objected to the importation of unclassified strains. He documented that in an internal memo, copied to you." Whitmore blinked. Kramer growled, "Where'd the money go?" "Part of it," Wolfe said, "into untraceable transactions tied to personal accounts. The rest, into black market hybrid sales through a pseudonymous seller named Caltha Biotech." Whitmore turned to me. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe," I said, "but it's also your wife's maiden name and your company's burner phone." Wolfe pressed forward. "And when Milburn discovered the theft," he said, "you silenced him with a substance he'd been researching, fitting, poetic, and in your eyes, untraceable." Whitmore stood. "I want a lawyer." Wolfe didn't blink. "By all means," he said. "But first explain why the lab access logs were altered the night of Milburn's death, on a machine that only responds to your biometric key." That was it. Whitmore sank back into his chair, breath shallow, and the orchid, traitorous and lovely, kept blooming. When Kramer finally cuffed Whitmore, it was with the sigh of a man who hated being impressed. "Well, hell," he muttered. "I guess even bureaucrats know how to kill when money's on the line." Wolfe arched a brow. "Do not conflate bureaucrats with botanists, Inspector. One files forms, the other alters life." Kramer grunted. "He's both." "Precisely," Wolfe said, folding his hands like a priest closing a hymn book. Whitmore was led out, wilted and sullen. Margot exhaled for the first time in an hour. Knox said nothing. Leona looked like she'd tasted lemon. I walked Kramer to the door. "You ever get tired of Wolfe being right?" I asked. "Only when he's smug about it," Kramer growled. "So every time." Fritz entered, tray in hand, with delicate pastries that looked like they belonged in a Viennese exhibit. I took one. "What, no herbs?" I asked. Fritz sighed. "I thought Mr. Wolfe might appreciate neutrality for once." "Bah," Wolfe muttered. "A pastry without time is like a trial without a verdict." I bit in. Vanilla, silence, and justice. "Anyway," I said, "that orchid's still blooming." Wolfe glanced at it. "It's only pretending to be alive, much like its former owner." And that, I figured, was as close to a eulogy as Milburn was going to get. Kramer didn't say much as he clamped the cuffs on Whitmore and led him toward the hall. But what he did say would have made a Brooklyn dockworker blush. "All this," he muttered, yanking the professor by the elbow, "over a damn flower. Fraud, embezzlement, murder, because some daisy didn't feel like blooming." "It's not a daisy," I offered. "Orchids are prima donnas. You'd understand if you spent more time with plants and less with crooks." He shot me a look like I'd offered him tofu instead of steak. Whitmore didn't resist. He shuffled like a man who'd just realized intellectual superiority doesn't help much when the bracelets click shut. As he passed Wolfe's desk, his eyes darted to the blooming hybrid one last time. Wolfe didn't even look at him. "Inspector," Wolfe intoned, You may convey to the district attorney that the evidence includes forged greenhouse logs, altered security access, and a sample of the synthesized toxin kept frozen in a mislabeled soil sample in Chamber D. Kramer grunted. You're thorough. I'll give you that. Wolfe sniffed. That is not yours to give. It is simply a fact. The office door closed behind them, taking with it the stench of desperation and fraud. Fritz poked his head in a moment later. Should I prepare lunch? Wolfe waved him off. Only if it contains no plants, no petals, and no poetic metaphors, which ruled out Fritz's usual offerings and most of Wolfe's vocabulary. I leaned back in the red chair with my shoes politely off the Persian rug, watching Wolfe settle into his orchid-induced afterglow. If smugness had a scent, it'd be fertilizer. The funny thing about this one, the murder weapon looked like nature. Smelled like it too, if you didn't know better. The whole setup had been a masterclass in misdirection. A professor's death passed off as a horticultural accident, wrapped in scientific gobbledygook about spores and aggressive hybrids. A body slumped next to a humidifier like he'd just keeled over from a case of academic exhaustion. But Wolfe hadn't bought it, not for a second. Neither had I, to be fair. Though my skepticism had more to do with how jumpy Margot had been and how Whitmore avoided eye contact like it might give him botulism. The orchid, the glorious, inconvenient bloom, wasn't just a flower. It was a time bomb with petals. It bloomed after Milburn was dead, which meant someone wanted it to bloom then, to make a lie look natural. Wolfe always said the most dangerous lies are the ones that imitate truth too well. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, as if reading my mind, "remind me never to trust anything that grows quietly in the dark. I'll add it to the list, right under spinach." He grunted. Sometimes the dirtiest secrets come from the cleanest-looking leaves, and sometimes the rarest bloom is just a killer's last lie in disguise. Leona returned the next morning to retrieve her statement. Dressed in black and grey, hair sharp, heels sharper, voice at its iciest. "You saved my department's reputation," she told Wolfe. "For what that's worth." "It is worth nothing," Wolfe said without looking up from his Times. "The reputation will be tattered again within the fiscal quarter." She didn't argue. She turned to me. "Mr. Goodwin, thank you for the manner in which you handled things." That was vague enough to be polite and cold enough to be final. I opened the door for her. "Any time. And if you ever need someone to investigate a grant application or a greenhouse romance, I come with references." She smiled. "Barely. I think I'll stick with plants. They lie less." Then she was gone. She'd survived with her name intact, her pride mostly bruised, and her curiosity about Wolfe probably buried under a mountain of loathing. I watched her walk away and didn't feel a pang. Well, maybe just a small one, but only because the coat she wore was terrific. The notebook was stuffed between 2 volumes of tropical climates and temperate deceit. That's what Wolfe called it. I just called it evidence. It was Milburn's, leather-bound, the kind professors like to pretend they're too busy to keep but always do. I flipped through it in Wolfe's office after the dust had settled. Mostly scientific babble, pH readings, temperature graphs, notes about pollination schedules. But on page 73, things changed. "Hybridation unethical, unauthorized strains appearing in Chamber B," one line read. Another, "Knox denied knowledge, Whitmore too smooth." Then underlined, in heavier script, "If this is as I suspect, it's not a mistake, it's theft." And finally, scribbled in the margin, "Spore compound moved, label changed." He'd known. Maybe not the full picture, but enough to know someone was cooking up something wrong in his greenhouse, enough to get himself killed. I passed the notebook to Wolfe, who leafed through it with more reverence than I'd seen him show to most living things. Foolish, but brave, he said. Both can be fatal, I added. Wolfe nodded. And frequently are. Milburn had died for a flower, but not just any flower. A lie with roots, petals, and just enough perfume to hide the rot beneath. Some men dig their graves, others cultivate them. Fritz came in carrying a crystal bowl like it held the Holy Grail. Voila, he said, placing it on the dining table with flourish. Salade d'orchidée. I blinked. You fed Wolfe what? He beamed. Petals from the very orchid on Mr. Wolfe's desk. Lightly candied, symbolic. I took 2 steps back. Wolfe looked up from his chair, spotted the bowl, and froze like someone had just threatened to dust his orchids with bleach. Fritz, he said slowly, are you telling me you harvested a murder exhibit and converted it into garnish? Only 1 petal. That plant, Wolfe growled, is both evidence and metaphor. I will not ingest either. He stood. Fritz wilted. I shall remove it at once. Do so, Wolfe said, and fumigate the kitchen. I made a noise halfway between a laugh and a gag. For the record, I said, I'll be dining at Rusterman's tonight. Later, Wolfe summoned me for a final thought before vanishing into the orchid room like a disgruntled deity. I abhor 3 things above all, he said, murder, deceit, and undercooked spinach. I nodded solemnly. Duly noted. In that order? He didn't dignify that with a response. Then, this case proves what I have long suspected. That plants can be accessories to murder? That intellect, when unaccompanied by ethics, produces rot. He pushed back from his desk. See that I am not disturbed for the remainder of the day. Even by orchids? He almost smiled. Almost. Then he was gone, swallowed by that warm, hissing jungle behind the glass doors. And somewhere in that humid haze, justice bloomed, quietly, defiantly, like a lie that had finally run out of soil. In the greenhouse of deception, even the rarest bloom cannot thrive without truth. What began with the quiet death of a botanist ended in the unmasking of ambition dressed as science, and loyalty crushed beneath the petals of betrayal. Justice, in Wolfe's hands, came not with drama, but with precision. And yet, one is left to wonder, was it envy, desperation, or simply the fear of being left behind that made the crime take root? Would you have seen through the orchid's lie, or believed in its beauty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.